Honorable Member for Vieux-Fort South.
Mr. Speaker, may I take a few moments just to thank you for your words of sympathy and condolence on the death of my brother, my eldest brother, and to add how much I appreciate your words, and you're absolutely correct that you were a close friend of my younger brother, Owen. In fact, you were shared partners up to his death in his law office. So your words, therefore, resonate. I also want to thank those individual members on the other side who have come to me to express similar words of condolence. But on a different note, I want to take the opportunity to wish you a very successful tenure. I know that if you had any illusions about this tenure, that must have been shattered a few moments ago, given by what took place in this honorable house. But I'm certain that with your guidance, that this house will command its business with the respect, decorum, with the conventions and the traditions that have governed the business of the house. So I really wish you the very best, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the estimates of revenue and expenditure. Mr. Speaker, I can well understand the delight, the joy, the pleasure that the member for Micoud South and his minister in the Ministry of Finance derived felt experience when they announced that the economy had grown by 3%. Of course, that announcement was greeted by understandable theater, the thumping of the desk and so on. And by all accounts, this would be good news to herald the estimates of revenue and expenditure. But very wisely, the Minister of Finance, the member for Micoud South, cautioned that this was a preliminary figure. And indeed, in the Economic and Social Review, the authors included a section that warned that these figures were preliminary and consequent on the new arrangements for computation of economic data for St. Lucia. So I would think that that is a very wise thing to have done, to say that it is a preliminary figure, either with the possibility of a plus or a minus in the long term. However, it was a little troubling that none in their presentation, except for this exchange that took place very briefly yesterday between the member for Castries South and the member for Castries Southeast, none seemed anxious to admit that the vital statistics on this economy was helped by a rebasing of GDP figures. This is critical and crucial because as we assess those statistics, we really do need to have a clinical understanding of what took place with rebasing and how they impact and adjust with the figures we present. In 2017, last year, the Statistical Office of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, for whatever reason, completed what is described as a backcasted national account series for the period 2006 to 2016, using new guidelines set out by the UN system of national accounts. That was the justification. And we see again that that is explained in the opening pages of this economic and social review. But crucially, and I'm not, apart from some observations that I will make, I'm not going to object to that particular activity. I'm not at this stage, apart from some objections. Crucially, they decided to include commercial real estate in the GDP estimates. With the inclusion of commercial real estate in the GDP estimates, the base would have shifted up and therefore result in higher GDP figures. Put it differently, for years, even the administration that I had the honor to lead, Mr. Speaker, complained bitterly about the compilation of GDP figures because we had always felt that a sizable amount of economic activity was excluded from those GDP figures. So it was always on the cards that GDP figures would be revisited to determine what really qualified as economic activity to be included in those figures. And every year there was a vigorous debate. Why just commercial real estate property in the GDP estimates? I don't know. I haven't had an opportunity to speak with any statistician, but that is the case. What we have to understand is this, that once that was done and the rebasing was accepted, the change immediately impacted the debt to GDP figures. Immediately. The debt to GDP figures would be lower as the fixed debt will now be expressed over a higher base. But it's not your debt to GDP figures alone that will be affected. The overall deficit will be affected. Because if it's expressed as a ratio of GDP, it's going to be affected. The current deficit will similarly be affected. All will be impacted. As a percentage of GDP, they will also be lower, as indeed happened in this case. Now, to understand this, it is worth considering the old and new debt to GDP ratios. And remember, Mr. Speaker, that the estimates of revenue and expenditure are premised on this 3% growth. So we need to look at it. If you look at the period from 2006 to 2016, because that is the base that they used, and those are interesting dates to choose, but never mind, Mr. Speaker. Let us see what it yields. In 2006, the old GDP figures would have shown a debt to GDP ratio of 56.6%. With the rebasing, that goes to 53.1%. In 2007, the old would show GDP of 56.5. Then under the new nomenclature, it goes to 50.9. 2008, 56.3, and we're talking about debt to GDP ratios. It's important that we clarify that, Mr. Speaker. So in 2008, your debt to GDP ratio would have been 56.3. It went down with the new nomenclature of 51.1. In 2009, the debt to GDP ratio would have been 55.3 with the new nomenclature down to 53.6. 2010, the debt to GDP ratio would have been 57.4. And then to 2010, Mr. Speaker, it goes down to 54.6. And you can begin to see the 3.2 difference already. In 2011, the debt to GDP ratio was cast at 60.7. It went down with the new nomenclature to 58.6. In 2012, it was cast at 65.7 1 year later, at 65.7, but under the new nomenclature, new rebase figures, 62.5. Then in 2014, the old debt to GDP ratio was 74.5. It went under the new nomenclature to 66.5. And then in 2015, on the eve of new elections in 2016, the old debt to GDP ratio was 75.4. It went down to 65.4. What does this mean? What does this mean? I want Mr. Speaker, to target for a moment the new debt to GDP ratio. In 2015, the old figures recorded a debt to GDP ratio of 75.4. The new magic one, the rebased GDP, for the same year, 2015, cast the ratio at 65.4, a full 10 points difference. Voila! What this means is that this new government has new room to maneuver to borrow thanks to this statistical adjustment in the compilation of GDP. The question is going to be whether we are going to use that 10 percentage points in a responsible way going forward. That's going to be the question. Of course, and these are my asides, Mr. Speaker, my casual observations, Mr. Speaker. I have personally found it always curious that on both occasions, when the UWP was in office, 2006 to 2011, and now since June 2006, there has always been a rebasing exercise. 2016, always a rebasing exercise. It must be just happy coincidence. Always been a rebasing exercise to readjust GDP figures. This has been a mystery to me, Mr. Speaker. A real mystery. But then, that seems to be the fact of life. That seems to be the fact of life. Now, I said, Mr. Speaker, that how we choose to use this little space in this economy becomes critical. But I want to make the point that the relationship between high growth rates and weak fiscal performance is well established. In my lifetime, over 20 years, 19, 20 years, I have watched countries with high growth rates, but weak fiscal fundamentals enter the doors of the IMF. And so many examples exist. Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, to name a few. And if I may focus very briefly on Grenada, just for a moment, I recall in the earlier years, Mr. Speaker, when the Grenadians would boast of exceptional growth rates, 5%, 6%. And it was a common thing that they boasted ECCB meetings about these growth rates. But at the same time, they were boasting about their growth rates. When you looked at their fiscal performance, there was marked deterioration. They were creating deficits that were widening. And just as a salutary reminder, I remember the then Prime Minister Keith Mitchell, when I asked him, well, how were you able to achieve these growth rates? His response to me, Mr. Speaker, was, well, you know, it's the new call centers that we have established. And that has helped us a lot because people are in employment and they're earning an income, they're earning a salary. I said new call centers, but we have been trying to establish call centers in St. Lucia for quite a while. We're not succeeding. It says, well, the government has taken the lead. We have taken loans for these private sector investors and have employed and have given them money to establish and start these call centers. And you know what? Years later, the Grenadian economy collapsed. Went through 2 phases of fiscal adjustment before he was returned to office to clean up a mess which he himself had created several years earlier. Why? Because artificially he was pushing growth, creating artificial growth by borrowing, investing, and at the same time was not attending to his fiscal house. And that is what landed him in trouble. The same thing happened with Antigua. The same thing happened with, of course, St. Kitts and Nevis. And I would say that here in St. Lucia, while we may have been very cautious, it was a stark reality that we had to face. And that is really the fundamental challenge that we have. How do we as a country build growth rates in our economy on a sound fiscal foundation? How do we do it? And this has been St. Lucia's challenge over the years. And I would say, I'm only speaking for myself, that, Mr. Speaker, we commenced the process of structural adjustment in St. Lucia. When we introduced that, when we tried to deal with the issues of expenditure, particularly in respect of civil servants, we did not complete that process of putting the fiscal house in order. To that extent, you can say that this incoming government has inherited a fiscal house that required more adjustment so that the real benefits of growth could be enjoyed. The question is, after nearly 2 years of this administration, are we any closer, despite the thumping of desks? On the fiscal side, this is what, to use the language of another members, this is what the government's Bible says. I'm looking at page 53, Mr. Speaker. It says, quote, and this is really in sharp contrast to what the Minister of Finance said when he spoke. Because his argument was that there has been improved fiscal performance. I don't know whether he didn't have time to read this. And there's no mystery behind these things anymore. Everybody reads it. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, as much as you give praise to the technocrats who present this, but one of these days, it'd be an interesting exercise to sit down and go through these things clinically, because there are always inconsistencies, but today's not the day for that. But this is what it says. Quote, the central government's fiscal position is estimated to have deteriorated during the fiscal year 2017 and 18. A clear, categorical, bold statement of what for them must be fact. Preliminary estimates indicate a widening of the overall deficit, fiscal deficit, to 116.9 million or 2.5% of GDP in 2017-18, from 69.7 million or 1.6% of GDP in 2016-17. This performance was driven by elevated current expenditure and, to a lesser extent, higher capital spending, which were partly offset by an improvement in revenue receipts. I am not going to explore revenue receipts today. I think my 2 colleagues, a member for Castries East and a member for Castries South, were sufficiently clinical on that. I'm not going to go there today. Consequently, there was a reduction in the current surplus from 92.0 million in 2016-17 to 63 million. Similarly, the primary surplus fell from 89 million in 2016-17 to 45 million in 2017-18. These are my words. That's in this part of the document circulated for this meeting. Mr. Speaker, my point is very simple. And I suspect that the honorable members, the members on the other side, understand it. But the temptations sometimes could be great, could be extraordinary. My point, Mr. Speaker, is this: financing growth by debt will not cure our fiscal problems, not in the short term. And promising to spend $500 million on roads will not cure your fiscal problems. Three things have to happen. And that has been the burden of the submissions from the members on this side of the House, even if they did not put it in the language that I am using. One, to get our fiscal house in order and to complete the process of structural adjustment that had started with the former government, we have to continue to reduce expenditure while simultaneously raising revenue. And I'm not again going to go into a detailed analysis of this for other reasons, because if we were to judge by the actions of the government, there seemed to be a lot of money around. Two, and secondly, we have to reduce or contain the appetite for debt. This is crucial. And thirdly, and this has always been the biggest challenge, we have to finance capital investment from the surpluses generated by the economy. Very simple things, hard to do. The real question is this: what do these estimates of revenue and expenditure say about these three challenges? How do the estimates of revenue and expenditure respond to these three challenges? How do they solve the problems that we have identified? The problems referred to in this economic and social review? How do we do it? What does it say? And in offering my own observations, Mr. Speaker, I will of course make use of the observations of my colleagues. Let us perhaps take one of the most critical components. Let us take a look at what is happening with expenditure, particularly wages and salaries. Let's take a look at that. And as an aside, Mr. Speaker, and totally as an aside, all of us have noted in the estimates of revenue and expenditure that the amount that is going to the payment of pensions alone is $88 million. Now that is a frightening thing. Why? Because 10 years ago, it was in the 40s, 45, 46 million. And what it's really saying is that despite the reforms that have been undertaken, Mr. Speaker, to pension reform in St. Lucia, like new public officers go to the NIS to handle their pensions, what it is saying with a fairly young public service, we should expect that in the next 5 years, we're going to top easily $100 million out of your revenue and expenditure to the payment of pensions. Again, the adjustment was only partial. But let's look at wages and salaries. It is noted, Mr. Speaker, that expenditure, and I'm looking, Mr. Speaker, at the budget summary, Roman numeral 3, I think it is, if I'm correct. It is noted that expenditure on wages and salaries for 2017-18 is projected to be about 2% lower, EC 10 million, than the budgeted amount. The approved estimates for 2017-18 is casted at 490.1 million. The projected outturn now records it at 480 million. For this financial year, I note that expenditure climbs to $501.8 million, an increase of $21.83 million. In effect, wages and salaries are projected to be higher about 4.6%, EC $21.83 million, higher for 2018-19 than the projected outturn for 2017-18. What is the significance of this increase? Why is it happening? What is it for? Is this increase due to higher wages for civil servants, despite the fact that no allocations have been made for retroactive wage settlements? When you look at page 7 of the estimates, what is it for? Or will it be due to onboarding of more staff, despite the fact that a number of short-term employed solutions have been made redundant since fiscal 2017-18? What is this about? What is it about? But then take a look at current expenditure. At another head. Current expenditure increased by 4.4%, but Eastern Caribbean $39.8 million during the fiscal year 2016-17, and is projected to grow by an additional 5.3%, that is $49.73 million by the end of fiscal year 2017-18. Further, for fiscal year 2018-19, the government proposes current expenditure of $1.055 billion, representing a further increase of 6.5%, Mr. Speaker, approximately $64 million over the projected figure for 2017-2018. This is interesting. And some might want to ring alarm bells. I'll refrain for the time being, but it is interesting. What this means, Mr. Speaker, is this. In effect, expenditure is increasing at an increasing rate. Capital expenditure, on the other hand, is shrinking. Current expenditure is exploding. It seems that the government is growing consumption, and maybe it has a policy interest in growing consumption, especially after you reduce VAT, at an alarming rate, and reducing capital investment. That's another observation. But then we go back to basics. We go back to fundamentals. We go back to declarations, commentaries, statements. From the look of this, the growth trend in current revenue is not consistent with the policy of debt containment at all. And expenditure management, which was advocated by the UWP administration prior to forming the government, that was our sin. That was the sin of the government I once had the honor to lead. And then the appetite for expenditure grows. Look at transfers. Why the subterfuge? In 2016-17, as a member for Castries South pointed out, transfers, meaning payments to statutory bodies, parastatals, government companies, etc., amounted to $123.6 million. What's happening here? The approved estimates allocated $141.8 million, but the projected outturn for 2017-18 puts it at $135.5 million. But look at the estimates for 2018-19. The fourth column, Mr. Speaker. Look at it. The budget estimate for 2018-19 puts expenditure at $142.4 million. Similarly, in 2017-18, what accounted for the increase of 9.6% in transfers relative to the outturn for 2016-17? What is the explanation for the further 5% growth projected for the upcoming fiscal year? What is the explanation? We haven't heard any, have we? But you're looking at the issue of expenditure, which I seem to be suggesting that this House, if it has to resolve the fiscal problems of the country, has to contain expenditure as best as it could. I mean, this has been the message from the member for Castries East, the Honorable Leader of the Opposition. Of course, my colleague from Castries South has pointed out a rather curious, I don't know whether this social and economic review was not properly edited, but the very curious thing that it makes the point at page 56 that current transfers rose by, in fact, not to get into trouble, I think I best read it again, because I don't want to be accused of misleading the House or anything like that. It says, current transfers rose by 19.7 million, mainly on account of larger transfers to statutory bodies, which grew by 13% to 121.3 million. This was occasioned by the subvention to a newly established body and increased contributions to another organization for clearance of outstanding payables. How could technical staff in the Ministry of Finance write such things? And you notice I'm not blaming government officials for this. I'm not saying that some minister had his hand in this, but this is, you can't do Parliament this. You can't do the House of Assembly this. You can't speak about entities that are supposed to exist, present figures, and yet not say what they are. And I'm not suggesting that there was any underhand or subterfuge. Not at all. But I'm just making the point that if you're going to have such massive transfers, such significant transfers, the House needs to know where those transfers are going to and to whom. In other words, which entities are targeted to benefit and will likely continue to benefit from these transfers. Now, I have looked at the issue of expenditure, and I admit that I'm being very eclectic, jumping from head to head, because we have time constraints, and there are some delicate matters that I have to touch pertaining to my constituency. I know you understand that. So I have had to select. The story of capital expenditure is very telling. And for me, it's a mystery. It's a mystery. Capital expenditure, from appearances, has underperformed significantly. In fiscal year 2016-17, actual capital expenditure was over 14% less than capital expenditure in 2015-2016. And I am fully aware that there are times that you can't meet your capital expenditure program for the very simple reason that you can't raise all the money to finance it. And believe you me, when you don't raise all the finance to finance your capital expenditure, it turns out to be a benefit because your debt GDP ratios also benefit by it. Despite this underperformance in 2016-17, the government budgeted EC 362 million for fiscal year 2017-18, representing EC 142 million, or 65% more than actual expenditure in 2016-17. The result, capital expenditure is projected to be 35% less than the budgeted amount for 2017-18 and 8% less than the amount spent in 2015-16. So, what we have? We have an increasing budget. The figures are going up. But while we have an increasing budget, we have a diminishing emphasis on investment on the capital side within the economy. If capital expenditure is diminishing as a proportion of total expenditure, moving from 20% in 2015-16, and I'm repeating myself, 16% in 2016-17, and 17% in 2018-19, what therefore is the overall impetus for investment and growth in the overall economy? Now maybe when we come to the policy debate, we will have some more interesting exchanges on that subject. But Mr. Speaker, you will agree with me that I have demonstrated by looking at the consequences of the rebased figures, that the government has more room to borrow because of the rebasing of GDP figures. Now, let me be clear, Mr. Speaker. In actual fact, rebasing may have benefited both sides. Because when you rebase, you have to look at the figures for the previous year. And these things, you know, there's an interesting aspect to this, Mr. Speaker, too, because you see, Mr. Speaker, when you are in the hot chair and you're preparing budget figures, it doesn't necessarily mean that you get the comfort to get all the figures you need. But if we look at growth over this period, the selected period of 2007 down to 2017, this is the picture that emerges. And of course, it was touched on without reference by the member for Swazelle Solibus. But let's look at it. I'm referring, Mr. Speaker, to page 86. In 2007, the growth rate was cast at 2.0, 2008, 5.3, and I believe this is what he was praising no end in his contribution. Then it was reduced to minus 1.1. In 2010, it climbed to 0.2%. Then in 2011, it climbed to 3.5, and now that's a famous figure. I'm sure the member for Castries North would want to reflect and speculate on that figure, but that's for another show, as they say. In 2012, minus 0.6. 2013, minus 1.3. In 2014, the growth rate was 3.6. In 2015, minus 0.9. And then in 2016, 3.4%. Truth is, I didn't realize that we had had such a healthy growth rate in 2017. But that's the consequence of rebasing. And then, of course, this magic figure of 3% for this financial year. But, Mr. Speaker, we now must return to reality. The fact is, the greater the deficit widens, the more the deficit widens, the greater there will be the temptation to borrow. Because if you don't want to borrow, then you must take the hard and painful decisions. And this is exactly what is happening, because the temptation to borrow is becoming increasingly attractive. Let's look at the Bible again at page 58 and see what it says about debt. And certainly my own personal view is that once you're writing a budget presentation, even for the estimates of revenue and expenditure, you better read what's in this, because you can suddenly find the two colliding, because they're presenting different scenarios. Unless you're going to unless what you're going to do is to renounce and denounce one. It says at page 58, the official stock of public debt, which includes central government liabilities, government guaranteed and public non-guaranteed debt, rose by 3.4% to $3,177,000,000 at the end of 2017. This was equivalent to an estimated debt to GDP ratio of 68.5%, down from 69% in 2016. The rate of debt accumulation picked up in 2017, marginally above the average of 3.3% over the preceding 3 years. Now that's a startling statement. Very startling statement. And then, of course, in the next paragraph, they go to debt with public corporations. I'm sure somebody might want to read that. So, this is where we are. That's the reality. But I note the following, Mr. Speaker. Let us go back to some basic fundamentals. The primary balance. And when we speak of primary balance, we simply mean total revenue less total expenditure, excluding interest payments on debt. That stood at an overall surplus position of 0.7% of GDP, 29.8 million in 2015-16, the last financial year before the Labour administration left office. The projected fiscal surplus for 2017-18 is estimated at a mere 1% of GDP, and is projected to decrease to 0.3% of GDP for fiscal years 2018-2019. This is merely confirming what we read earlier. This suggests that outside of the pressures of servicing existing debt obligations, the increase in expenditure in other areas is having a negative impact on the fiscal accounts of the central government. Look at the overall deficit, Mr. Speaker. Total revenues less expenditures stood at 2.2% in 2015-16. The projected fiscal deficit for 2017-18 is 2.5%, 30 basis points above the outturn for 2015-16. The overall deficit is projected to widen to 3.4% for fiscal year 2018-19. It's an unruly horse, establishing, and that's my point, a reversal of the fiscal consolidation efforts made over the period 2012 to 2016. So much for this brilliant and astute management of this economy. Last one, let's take the current surplus now. Similarly, a healthy current surplus of EC 81.4 million obtained for the fiscal year 2015-16 is projected to dwindle to EC 43.3 million for fiscal year 2018-19, representing slightly more than half of what obtained at the end of fiscal 2015-16, just 2 months after the UWP administration came into office. Clearly, as a member of Castries also eloquently said, these results are not consistent with the so-called conservative approach to the management of the fiscal affairs of this country, as outlined by the UWP prior to the assumption of office. We were the profligate government, I believe, as you were described. The strategy was supposed to be a balanced budget where expenditures are equal to revenues. We were promised that 2 years ago. Zero additional debt and expenditure containment. Sadly, these elements are woefully lacking from the statistics that has been made available to us. And now, my colleague again from Castries made a brilliant point, that ominously payables have increased, I think, from roughly 22.9 million to about 88. Now, I don't know whether that was seasonal. In my years as Minister of Finance, I do recall that your payables could increase on the eve of budget. But this is extraordinary. This is 88 million. It means, therefore, quite that if this had to be added to your debt to GDP ratio, it is representing approximately 1.5%, and this would increase your debt to GDP ratio to about 70%. If, of course, you haven't developed the revenue to deal with it and you have to pay for it in a new quarter, then clearly that's going to impact heavily on your expenditure pattern. But I think all members need to study carefully one other aspect that I want to touch, this issue of taxes on income and profits. A serious development. And I'm not so sure why this is the case, because we are not given the kind of reasons that we would like to have to reflect on this properly. Because on the one hand, the government is saying that there are an economic recovery is underway, private sector is very happy. I know during my tenure as Minister of Finance that a lot of these major institutions paying corporate taxes had done some house cleaning, wrote off bad debts, cleaned up their books. St. Lucian's paid a price for it, a very, very heavy price. I mean, who can ever forget the Royal Bank of Canada, First Caribbean, Bank of Nova Scotia? And I'm hoping very soon that we can have a serious policy debate on the behavior of banks in this country, because what is happening in this country is totally unacceptable. The disregard, the abuse of citizens of St. Lucia must come to an end. And I regret that year in, year out, when I pleaded with the central bank that these banks be investigated and guidelines be issued to these banks to deal with matters at hand, somehow they never summoned the courage to do so. Now the time has come to deal with this matter. So Mr. Speaker, we should have been expecting of increases on income and profits. And may I, Mr. Speaker, just in passing also say, I will stay away from discussing the unemployment figures. Obviously, the member for Suzel was in dreamland when he said unemployment was low. I don't have the passion to respond to the member for Suzel today. We'll deal with that later, because my advice is also be very cautious, as you learned recently with the unemployment figures. But that having been said, one of the areas where I think we need to have a serious look at is the statistics held by the National Insurance Scheme to get a better sense of what's happening with unemployment in the ground. And I believe it will do the government good as it will do the country good if annually we can ask I guess they do that in their reports, but for budgetary purposes it becomes crucial. We can ask the National Insurance Scheme to give us numbers about registered insurers. I think this is crucial because we can have a clearer sense. Obviously, there are hundreds and thousands outside of the NIC net, but that's going to be an important figure.
Honourable Member, you have 15 minutes left, sir.
Say that again, Mr. Speaker.
15 minutes, sir.
Oh, 15 minutes, Mr. Speaker. Wow. You're not in a generous mood, are you, Mr. Speaker? All right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's look at taxes on income and profit. That decreased by approximately 1% for fiscal year 2017-18 when compared to the actual 2016-17. In fact, corporate tax are projected to fall by 4.8% for fiscal year 2017-18 when compared to fiscal year 2016. Why? What is happening here when so many books are supposed to have been cleaned? What is happening? Taxes on income will likely be reduced by 1.02% at the end of fiscal year 2018 when compared to the previous year. The one area of improvement was, of course, the traditional one with respect to the arrears. But overall, that went up, I think, by about 1.4%. By no means this is significant. It's really lackluster. My simple point is that what is happening with these firms, with the payment of taxes, both at the personal level and the corporate level, these are not consistent with purported expansion of the economy by 3%. And the significant increase in employment, business activity, and profits reported by the minister within the Ministry of Finance, the distinguished famous Senator Eubaldus Raymond. I hope I got the pronunciation right. Now, look at your social economic review again at page 55, just to buttress. You've been doing well so far. Yeah, look at what it says. Yes. After 3 consecutive years of growth, receipts from income taxes fell by 2.2% to 252.8 million in 2017-18. And Mr. Speaker, it's at page 55. Revenue from individual income declined by 1 million, the first decline in 14 years. Why? Why? Now, Mr. Speaker, you told me a while ago that I have 15 minutes. It must have been down now to about 12 minutes. Every budget has its oddities and peculiarities, things that are inserted in a budget under pressure, you can't find right nomenclature. I have a few that I want to look at before I close, before I come to my constituency. Take now a look at the capital program financing, and Mr. Speaker, you can look at page 513 in the estimates if you like. There's a financing item for 7.2 million or 7.3 million. And I'm speaking about the capital program financing. The question is, what assets will be sold to earn 7.3 million? What's the story here? Why is this not declared? I need to know. Some $3.4 million is allocated to the refurbishment of government offices. Why, in this season of high unemployment, in this season of serious shortages of staff, we are spending $3.4 million to refurbish government offices? Now tell me, which government offices? It couldn't be the one for the Minister of Economic Development. He just has a brand new building. And I haven't ever been in that building, you know, Mr. Speaker. Just imagine. Never been in that building. No. Yes, no, I'm wrong. Once. A book launching. Yes, so lucky. Now, given yes, we did. Maybe I should have invited you to break ground with me for the administrative sentence you thought that you would have survived, but I'm coming to that. I am looking at 516, Mr. Speaker. So, which government offices will be reorganized and refurbished for $3.5 million? Why are we spending this money? Given the purported poor stewardship of the Labour Party during the period 2011 to 2016, and it is intriguing, when you go through the capital budget, there are no major new projects included as part of the capital budget. A lot of it is what existed before. Why? What's the subterfuge? But if PPPs are going to be the new modality, then we will wait for the policy debate. At page 523, Mr. Speaker, I direct your attention of the estimates. Look under the heading Treasury Notes. A reference is made to a loan from Shock Estate Limited. What exactly is the purpose of the loan from Shock Estate Limited? Who are they? For $4.6 million. Who are they? Why are they in a position to lend $4.6 million if that is the reality? Then finally, Mr. Speaker, I turn to the issue of the annual rate of inflation. I promise you I will be very brief, Mr. Speaker, because I think we need to be very careful. Again, the reference is at page 105. Mr. Speaker, again, the honorable members were gleeful with the announcement that the rate of inflation has declined significantly, that it is 0.1, and I believe that to some extent, this should be understood on this side. Let's face reality, the price of fuel has remained relatively steady. That's one factor. The VAT that was introduced has settled in, so the inflationary impacts. But whether that is the reality on the ground is a very different matter. And I believe that we also need to be a little careful, again, with statistics. Mr. Speaker, if you look at the 2017 column on extreme right, you'll notice that the figure that is quoted is 0.1%. It's page 105. Now, that is the average, you know, Mr. Speaker. That is the average. But when you look at inflation immediately below from point to point, which is what you should be looking at, in 2007, 6.8, 2008, 3.4, 2009, something extraordinary happened, minus 3.1, 2010, 4.2, 2011, 4.8, 2012, 5%, 2013, 0.7, 2014, 3.7, 2015, minus 2.6, 2016, minus 3.0. The average there gives you 2.2. What we need to be looking at when you're looking at inflation is really the point-to-point movement. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the next few minutes that I have, I want to turn to some matters pertaining to the South. I search for comfort for my constituency, Beaufort South. In his contribution yesterday, the member for Swazel Saltipel declared very boldly that the government is, quote, not in the habit of stopping projects that are meaningful. That was his quote. I don't think he will challenge that, Mr. Speaker. Exact words. And I know he saw me writing it. It seems to me, if, as he has declared, he's not a politician, he says he is not a politician, and by the way, I accept I'm a politician. I think it's an honorable undertaking. You one day will understand that the greatest opportunity we have had is to serve people. So you shouldn't run away from declaring yourself a politician. But I'll tell you this. It seems, well, my only advice, don't stay close to him. You see among them there? I might tell you who to sit closely by, but certainly not him. Now, it seems to me, if, as he declared, he's not a politician, then he is fast becoming one. I want to ask him in all sincerity whether the completion of St. Jude Hospital is not meaningful, whether the construction of the administrative complex in VA4 is not meaningful, whether the completion of a water redevelopment project for the Beaufort community is not meaningful, and why should the people of Beaufort be punished over this? Why? I want to go through this. On assuming office, this government, without a shred of explanation, stopped a CDB-financed and approved project to improve the provision of water supply to Beaufort North and South. The project was on the verge of implementation. For years, the people of Beaufort have suffered with water problems because of a very bad catchment area and the turbidity of the water. Now the capital estimates make provision for $4.8 million for the so-called Beaufort water supply redevelopment. And I draw your attention, Mr. Speaker, the reference page is 480 of the estimates. Of that amount, $1.3 million is said to be a CDB grant, $1.0 million bonds. And why bonds? I want to find out. And $2.5 million from other sources, and I'm not told what are these other sources. What is that other source? Now the problem, Mr. Speaker, why this matter is raised is this. And I heard a member asking who stopped the project. Well, I want to find out because that project had attracted an approved loan, a signed loan of US $19 million from the Caribbean Development Bank. That was the reality. And I can give you an update of where we were with WASCO with this project. There were conditions precedent to the disbursement of the loan. As I said, the approved loan from the Caribbean Development Bank was $19,675,000 US. A grant, the approved grant was $335,000 US. The project was launched in VA4, I believe, but not I believe, for a fact, in November 2015. The contract was finalized between the government of St. Lucia and CDB. WASCO was the executing agency. All the conditions precedent to the loan were met. Everyone. All was done. The condition precedent to first disbursement in relation to infrastructure works, the recruitment of invitations, advertisements were in progress. The process for acquisition of required lands was also in progress. The procurement procedures applicable to the loan was in the process of preparation for invitation proposals. So too were the process to retain engineering consultants. The full unit was supposed to be established, and the Caribbean Development Bank had signaled that they were expecting, and I believe it was in the process of being implemented, a fully functional CIS acceptable. That was on December 31st, 2015. Now, what I don't understand, this loan was made available to the government institution at extraordinary low rates of interest. In fact, the part of it came from the ordinary capital of CDB for 17, special fund resources for 25 years. There was a grace period of 5 years for repayment on the loan. And the interest rate, the OCR component was 3.95, and a loan secured by the bank from the European Investment Bank, 2.23%, and of course the SFR loan was 2.5%. Now, I think I've said enough, Mr. Speaker, not to go into the balance. How much time left, Mr. Speaker? What's that?
Should be winding up, sir.
No, just tell me how much time left.
Within you 2 minutes, sir.
2 minutes, thank you. But I want to give the honorable member notice that there are two other matters that I want to discuss in relation to you that I cannot today. I guess, you see, with the water project, Beaufort South was not as fortunate as Dennery North. The involvement of the Mexicans saved Dennery North, but Beaufort South had no Mexicans to save it, because Dennery North was allowed to go on, but Beaufort South stopped. But I know the Minister of Agriculture will probably have enough time to give some explanations as to why this happened. Why would claim people's lives like that? Why? I'll soon be gone to the great beyond. These people will need their water. Why do this? What's the purpose of it? As for St. Jude, I accept that I have 60 seconds left. We'll deal with that, with a policy debate. And so too, Mr. Speaker, we'll deal with the Owen King EU Hospital on that day. I have much to say. I end on a note that it is heresy to suggest that the creation of a statutory board at the Owen King EU Hospital equals privatization. Absolute heresy. Mr. Speaker, I thank you for your indulgence and your kindness. Thank you.